So first off, I want to just draw to your attention that this webinar is related to a program we're going to be running in November, at November 5th to the 7th in Boston, hosted at Vertex. It's called Optimizing the Operating Models for Analytics and Design Thinking. It's going to feature speakers such as Mary, Patrick McLaughlin from Frito-Lay PepsiCo, and Vicky Walia from Prudential. And we're going to go through a number of different models and ways of thinking about how to align and optimize the operating model with some real-life examples from our guest speakers, such as Mary. With that, I want to set the stage a little bit. And this term operating model is something that we've heard for a long time now, and in fact, it's used almost kind of everywhere in organizations, and yet what we found is that if you were to go to, say, your top 10 senior leaders and you were to ask them each to articulate what is the operating model for your organization, you would not get a consistent answer from every single one of them. And we think that that is actually, we're finding it's actually a source of some of the problems we're having around organizational performance, around strategy execution. Our colleagues here at the center, Sue Morman, Chris Worley, and Beth Gunderson, do really deep and good work around organization design. And you need to have the strategy and the organization design set first. But then when you talk about what do we have to do to actually get the right performance within the operating model, there's a lot of detail that people don't really pay enough attention to. So this first slide here is designed to help to kind of draw out what are the things we need to be thinking about. Now, if you notice on the right-hand side, I have what's called the operational business model, and within that, I have the operating model, talent model, and financial model. And the reality is that when our business leaders talk about the operating model, they're really thinking as kind of strategists and engineers. I mean, how do you run the business in terms of what are the products and services we need to create and get out the door in the right way to be able to satisfy our customers? And so for that reason, in the middle panel there where it says strategic business model, that first line is customer value. So when we talk about the operating model, typically what people mean is they're talking about the operations side of the business, what is it that actually creates the products and services so that we get the customer value that we need for the people who actually enable us to stay in business. And this is whether we're a for-profit, nonprofit, or even a government agency. Where we find a lot of the dropped balls happen is and those other two parts that you see on the right-hand side, which is the talent and the financial models. And the reason why I'm calling them out separately is because there is way too much compartmentalization that happens. I mean, we know that you've got the business on the one hand and HR on the other, where the ball is often passed back and forth, and there isn't enough real-time integrated decision-making to make sure that you're actually doing the right thing across both the business and the people side. And the reality is that there's a lot of complexity when it comes to the business operating model. And on the business side of the operating model, there's a lot of complexity on the talent model on the people side. And then there's this other part that we usually try to ignore, which is the financial model. And oftentimes finance is coming in at the last hour and saying, you're either doing this right or wrong in terms of how much money is getting spent. But by that point, we've often made the wrong decisions in terms of how we're actually designing and optimizing the whole business model. And so it's really important to call out all three of those different parts, the operating model, talent model, and financial model. And their counterparts in the middle are customer value, employee value, and shareholder value. And if you think about it, customer value is often kind of the strategic, forward-looking, this is the thing we're trying to create so we can keep our current customers and then anticipate where the market's going to be going. Employee value is a concurrent, kind of coincident indicator of how well things are going. So we can't actually effectively create customer value in the way it needs to be in both the short term and the long term if we're not also creating the right value proposition for people to want to come and work with us, give us their discretionary effort, raise their hands, look out for things that might be outside of their job description but are still important so they don't fall through the cracks. And shareholder values, of course, at the end of the day, that's the piper that we have to pay, but it's oftentimes a backward-looking measure. And so the fact that customer value is forward-looking, employee value is contemporaneous, and shareholder value is often backward-looking also leads to a lot of the challenges that we have in terms of making sure you've got right alignment with the operating model. And if you think about it, On the right-hand side, operationally, that's where we tend to focus on what do we have to do today to keep the lights going and be able to execute the strategy. And yet, the complexity of what we have to do on the business side, within HR, within finance, is often overwhelming so that people get bogged down by just focusing on what's in their silo, and they don't know the right point to come out and how quickly and often they need to be coming out and integrating across these different silos. So that we're actually optimizing customer value, employee value, and shareholder value all at the same time. Now, just to add one more layer of kind of detail onto this, so here I've now taken the operational business model and the strategic business model, and right in the middle I've inserted organizational capability. Just like with the operating model, if I say to you, what are the capabilities that you need to succeed in your business, everybody can give an answer on this. But again, much like the word operating model, when people talk about the capabilities that we need, there's a lot of lack of precision in terms of really defining what it is we have to be creating. And again, what we found when we get into the details of doing this work with companies and helping them to actually improve their performance is that this organizational capability is a bit like a Rorschach test, kind of like an ink blot test, where people see, when you say organizational capability, people see and hear different things and they operationalize it different ways. And what we found is that it's really important to be really clear about that the organizational capability is the thing that really bridges what you have to do operationally on a day-to-day basis and what you're trying to create in terms of the value for the customer, the shareholder, and the employee. And that the organizational capability needs to be a true north that you keep on focusing on as you're doing your day-to-day in the operations side and the finance within HR, so that you can actually get to the right structure and processes and alignment. So to illustrate that, let me just give you an example. And we all know Google, and we could spend a long time talking about this. Let me just go really quickly through it, though, and point out that if we say kind of what is Google's business strategy, well, their strategy is to be the leading source to connect people to information. And that's actually been the strategy from day one. It was a very well set out strategy. But when the founders of Google, were sitting in their dorm rooms in college and were dreaming up this business model, they had no idea how the organizational capability was going to have to evolve as the actual strategy evolved. So the high-level strategy hasn't changed. It's still to connect people to information, but how that gets operationalized has changed dramatically over time. So throughout it all, the one core thing that gives them their strategic advantage is being able to dominate search. But what that means has evolved over time. So it started off with computer-based search. It then moved into mobile, and now it's gone into things like mapping. And so it's gone from active to now anticipatory search, so that when someone opens up a mapping program, we're not explicitly saying, Google, go find for me this information, but if you're using the Google mapping program, then it's now become a much more intuitive, you don't have to physically say, let me search for this particular piece of text on the web. But they've created an interface that's much easier for you to be able to do that. But mapping wasn't part of their original capabilities, even though today it's still it's helping them deliver on that original strategy. Now, another part in terms of the capability they've had to build over time is the ecosystems that they need to put onto the search engine. So in order to maintain access to us as the end users, over time they had to create a free browser because they wanted to not be cut out of people's searches on the desktop. And they bought YouTube so they could understand how people were interacting with video-based search and graphics-based search when it moved away from being just text. But when they bought YouTube, they didn't really have a complete business model for it yet. It was a learning process, and over time it's evolved. And as people moved from computers onto mobile devices, they had to then think about how they could maintain that access, and in particular in competition with Apple. So they then went out and bought and then promoted the Android operating system as a free service so that they could still be closely tied into all the search behaviors we're doing. And so if you think about it, there are different capabilities at each of these stages. So there's the capability in doing computer-based search. There's a capability in terms of mobile-based search. There's capabilities in mapping. They then had to have capabilities in terms of creating a browser, working with YouTube, and then creating a whole operating system for mobile phones. And if we go down to the bottom here, how they've interacted with the larger kind of internet and way that we're all working online has evolved as well. So it's at the point now where when we think about what's going on with autonomous cars, with how people are going to be accessing information while driving, who's going to own the brain within the car? Is it going to be the traditional car makers? Will it be technology companies like Google? They have to be playing really, really carefully into that. They're doing things like integrating their mapping with calendars so they can anticipate where you're going to go. If you look in the U.S., YouTube is now breaking out and actually starting to compete directly with cable companies on providing a low-cost way for people to be able to get their cable channels. Now, is that about search? Is that about connecting people information? Not necessarily. But because they went into YouTube to be able to have access to how people were interacting with video, this has opened up an adjacent business opportunity for them where they can undercut the cable companies and have YouTube play that role as well. So the capabilities that are involved in running YouTube and thinking about how to make the most money off of it, those have evolved as well. And if you think about it, looking across everything that's on this list, on the screen here, nothing has gone away. So they still have to be world-class in terms of text-based search. They then had to add on world-based capability in terms of doing this on a mobile platform, not just on a laptop or computer. And then now it's going into mapping and working with mobility in terms of cars, and then also now YouTube and competing with cable companies. And in each case, we're adding on more and more capability that Google has to be developing and delivering on so they can execute their strategy. And the challenge becomes, how do you make sure you're not compartmentalizing things too much within your organization so that you can keep your eye on the ball of that overall strategic capability? So to kind of summarize, and we're not going to spend a lot of time going through this because I want to turn this over to Mary and she'll talk about specific examples from her own experience. But they're at a very high level. If you think about it, there are different aspects of organizational capability in terms we have to build. So in terms of work design, there is work that has to be performed by roles, by teams, and then literally in an end-to-end business process view. And then within that, there are competencies, team structures, and actual business structures that you need to be able to be building and optimizing at the same time. While you're doing that, you have to make sure that you're staffing people in the right roles, and you're doing it at both the team level and also at the individual level, the team level, and organizationally. And then you need the HR and the people systems to integrate with that, whether it's around recruitment, development, promotions, career paths, et cetera. And then the other key parts, last but certainly not least, is the actual work itself. So you need to make sure that people are giving you their discretionary effort, they're actually giving you their aligned behaviors as individuals. You need the same thing at the team level, and we often don't spend anywhere near enough time talking about how to make things work well at the team level. And then that leaders themselves are also integrating effectively into this whole system, even though most leadership competency models we have don't really point them in the direction of making sure they're optimizing the operating model. This one table here just summarizes all of that, so I'm not going to go through it, but I'll just let you see it for a second. And ultimately, what we're talking about when we talk about optimizing the operating model is being able to execute effectively in every single one of these points of the table at the same time. And when we compartmentalize decision-making, when we take it and we cascade down who's responsible for what, and we get into organizational silos, we lose sight of these bigger picture things that almost always span across silos, span across business units, geographies, and it's that lack of integration across them that gets us in trouble. All right, so if you have any questions about this overall kind of introduction, I'm happy to hear them, but maybe you should keep them in mind as I turn it over now, and I want to introduce Mary O'Hara, who is a very great supporter of ours here at the center, and very much looking forward to hearing her comments now, and then also to join us in November in Boston.
Thank you, Alec, and very nice to speak with you all this afternoon. It's my privilege to do that. I'm a kindred spirit with Alec. We share an awful lot of point of view here on our philosophy about how to fundamentally improve and ensure the discipline of execution and the performance of organizations. What we call it, I'm a a leader at an organization called Blue Shield of California. We're a $22 billion health plan based here in California. But in my role, I'm both accountable for making sure that we institutionalize the right behaviors that are permissible in the system that reinforce moving towards a common direction and encourage an organization that begets talent, and make sure I chair the operating committee of our firm. And so in that respect, I also have to make sure that I'm introducing decision-making frameworks that help support the critical and the creative thinking to ensure that we don't have strategic drift and that we don't miss critical steps in terms of ensuring that our performance really is what we promise our members and that we want to live up to in terms of assuring our mission. Our mission really, broadly stated, is just fundamentally to make sure that all Californians have access to sustainably affordable, high-quality health care that's worthy of our family and friends. And in order to do that, what we've introduced is a very, you might think about it as a pretty rigorous process, but it is equally supported by behaviors that really do cause leaders, and we do find that leaders struggle with a lot of these concepts without really clear direction and tools that support every step of this process, and more importantly, facilitation and collaboration that goes horizontally and vertically. And so, Alec, if you wouldn't mind just moving to the next step, I'll walk you through, as an example, what we think about it, what a strategic architecture is. It truly is, from our vantage point, something that connects both from our mission, and our mission is simply stated a purpose. Then that moves to a strategy, and that strategy informs a business plan. But long before you get to that, it has to tell a very simple and a very clear and a very logical, compelling story. It has to define success in a very concrete way, both short-term and long-term. The point about philosophy that follows here is oftentimes where we see leaders jumping very quickly to solve a problem that they think they're aligned with organizationally on strategy, and it turns out they're solving the wrong problem. I'll put that in a pragmatic example in a moment. Underneath your philosophy are guiding principles, and that ought to inform how you're getting the work done, but is anchored in that philosophical set of beliefs, your deeply held beliefs. We're also trying to make sure that leaders in our organization don't skip a step. You know how that old expression, common sense isn't always common practice? Well, it is true, and it's often the case that leaders, certainly it's my experience, not just here but in other places, want to be seen to be working at the level of strategy, and it's a mask for not actually doing the work of the discipline of thinking required to get to the consistent performance and execution that I think Alec is talking about. He described it as an operating model. We describe it as a strategic architecture. If you move along to the next slide, Alec, just look top to bottom how we think about what a strategic architecture includes. Alec, do you mind moving to the next slide, please? It really does look at things from the point of view, as an example, when we think about strategy, when I first joined Blue Shield of California, it had 5 prime strategies, not the least of which was to be a great place to work. Now, you may interpret being a great place to work as bringing your dog to work, getting free food in the cafeteria, and paying people more than the market at median, as an example, right? That might be, in some people's mind's eye, what is a great place to work? I could have taken the time to build out an entire people strategy that in large measure solved the wrong problem. It took a dialogue and the discipline of thinking and the rigor associated with aligning on that at a philosophical level with our CEO to describe philosophically what my deeply held beliefs are and to share what his were to be sure that we had an alignment. I happen to believe that a people strategy is at the nexus of enabling a business strategy. And if it isn't something that's going to provide, as Alec has described, the sort of capabilities necessary to enable a business strategy, it's fundamentally not, it's not working. And so that's why we believe that it's really clear what our purpose is, and we have a point of view about prime things that are necessary to achieve that, For instance, lowering the cost of care in this country and the state to start, that's a prime strategy. You have to have a great place to work where great people want to come and help you achieve that really purposeful, really hard work. But underneath that requires philosophical alignment. And behind every one of these steps, there are tools and processes to help people articulate those things before they then execute to a business plan that in some cases is arguably solving the wrong problem. Underneath that are really clearly stated guiding principles. For instance, if philosophically we have a point of view that being a great place to work is actually an enabler to a business strategy, that means that people strategy has to enable that. Then a guiding principle might be, for us, that leaders at all levels are necessary in order to create an environment that causes talent that are a scarcity to come and pick us. That's a really important principle, that you need leadership at all levels, and it's not philosophically about what's on your business card. And so underneath that, what we call strategic pillars are initiatives, otherwise known as strategic thrusts, to get those principles in action. Like, you'd want to make sure that you're teaching leaders how to be great leaders at all levels. You'd want to make sure that they have the tools and the processes that are reinforcing mechanisms. That's what we mean by strategic pillars. In the place that we consistently see, to get people really clear philosophically, then you align on then what does that mean for our strategy and the key pillars to do that and the initiatives. The place that we often see unevenness, some of you might experience this, it's really in the middle. So what does it actually mean in terms of the knowledge and the skill and the behavior? Capital strategy point of view? Yep, I am.
Sorry, you just cut out for a minute. You're back.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
So we try to help facilitate the dialogue in a following way, right? So what is it directionally that you're trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? What does that business plan look like? And from there, what is your human capital? What do you need to know to be able to do this? What kinds of skills do you need to have to be able to do this? Fundamentally, who are you interdependent on? The notion that I have to go and talk to my colleagues is, though it might seem like common sense, how often I'm in operating committee meetings, as I'm sure many of you are, sitting around an operating committee table where my colleagues are realizing halfway through the year that they haven't actually had interdependency conversations with IT, for instance, a fundamental requirement from the system, an organizational capability requirement, a dependency to be able to execute against their mandates and their strategic pillars. That's a process that we also facilitate. Beyond human capital, what are the organizational capital implications? Have you actually negotiated that with your colleagues? Do they share those goals? Are they equally measured on that? Do you know what their constraints are? Financial capital, and it usually isn't the case that when you're doing things of such a strategic nature that there's only a one-time cost. There's utility to this. There's a tail to it. Does the system actually understand if we are signing up for this, this is what the long-term implications are, and it affects your operating expense on a long-term basis. Governance is often another place where we see that leaders struggle. How will I know that you and I are staying aligned? When will we know that we're making progress? Beyond getting to the ultimate goal post, how will we test and learn, and what feedback loops are necessary throughout that process? We try to help leaders through this, to give them tools behind every one of these steps. Getting to an operating model, our language is a little different than yours, Alec. Fundamentally is a choice point. Like, for instance, we're trying to change healthcare where it's similar to your experience in your financial life. Today, if you go to a doctor, you don't have real-time claims payment. And you might get a bill several months down the road and be quite surprised by the cost of that interaction. One of the things we're trying to do is to introduce something called real-time claims payment. So when you're at your doctor's office, you're settled up immediately, you know exactly what the bill is. Well, an operating model choice, for instance, that kind of capability shifts. Somebody who has spent many years paying a claim, their job just became digital. And you may choose that you want to rent that capability because it doesn't exist in a health plan. It's more resident in a financial services type of an industry. That's equally a choice around operating model. And we try to teach leaders how to make those choices, both from a financial point of view, from an availability point of view, how affordable is it, what's the likelihood that this is core to your competence and to your differentiation. That's what we mean by operating model, and you can't start there. You have to finish there. Insofar as understanding what your strategy is and what your choice points are and all of your interdependencies. There's also risks in all of these scenarios, and helping leaders understand how to discern what they are, and also to make choice points to the extent you can to plan in advance around mitigating for those things. Top to bottom, this is how we think about what a strategic architecture is, but it really fundamentally comes down to the discipline and the rigor of doing all of those steps, making sure that you're not skipping any of them, and that leaders understand how to do that with support and facilitation. And oftentimes HR is doing that, as is finance, to help make sure that people know how to do these things well. They have RACEs in place. They understand what their decision rights are. There are feedback loops in the system. And it's all in the support of making sure that the discipline of execution, the avoidance of strategic drift, the alignment organizationally is happening. And you don't always have to own it. Sometimes you have to rent it. Sometimes you have to buy it. Sometimes you have to build it. But those are strategic choices, and teaching leaders how to do that and make more time for critical thinking and less time for doing is why we've introduced and tried to institutionalize what we call a strategic architecture. But the risk of, over speaking, I'll just stop there. That's essentially the top to bottom, but I'm more than happy to answer questions.
So there actually is one comment from Marianne Boyle. She said, leadership coaching is a major benefit. Have you found that that's something that you've been able to use to help improve the strategic architecture?
Yeah, so I opened, and perhaps I wasn't explicit enough, I apologize. This is deeply, deeply institutionalized in terms of process to support critical thinking and strategic alignment and the discipline of execution. It is complemented by permissible behavior. And for sure, we deeply try to institutionalize the how to do that here as well. Both myself and our CEO spend an awful lot of time in a program, we call it our Lead to Excellence program, where we try to reinforce these processes and these tools, but from a behavior point of view, it's equally important. If I'm a win as much as I can versus win as much as we can person, if I am less likely to share organizational resources or talent, for instance, all of these processes aren't going to work. So we do absolutely spend a lot of time trying to teach leaders, here's what we fundamentally believe personal leadership looks like in action, the importance of the leadership of others, and the system leadership that's necessary to go along with these tools and processes. They go hand in glove.
Yeah, that's great. In research, it was quite a while ago. I don't want to say how long ago it was. I was doing some research on leadership competency models, and part of what I found that was kind of frustrating is that they tend to be, first of all, fairly vanilla, pretty much all very similar, and even though they can articulate important skills you want leaders to have, and there will be some customization where, a company might say, let's bring in something related to innovation if that's a particular strategic priority. To me, it seems like a lot of them lack the depth and kind of nuance that you need to be able to really align leadership behaviors with all the components of your strategic architecture here. Is this something you've tried to address through kind of an existing or change to a leadership competency model, or how much does this happen outside of that kind of a formal competency approach?
Yeah, thanks, Alec. I would say this. It is, again, a little bit about the discipline of this as much as it is what's old is new again, right? There's a lot of ancient wisdom that is true here. The fact of the matter is that none of us operate outside of a system, sometimes multiple systems. So knowing fundamentally what that system is that you operate in, having stakeholder analysis and deep skills to be able to, from a situational leadership point of view, to adjust and to know what kind of evidence you're going to bring in a different scenario to a different stakeholder, the basics of systems thinking still applies. The question is, why aren't organizations teaching leaders how to do that and truly holding them accountable to do that and reinforcing it? The same is true around personal leadership. Fundamentally, it's our experience. You could be the biggest strategic thinker and arguably have all the bright ideas, but candidly, nothing new here. If nobody trusts you and you don't have the emotional intelligence to match your strategic intelligence, it's arguably a system backlash. The antibodies come out and they try to find a way, either passively or aggressively, to diminish your ideas. So I don't believe, Alex, that there's anything new here. We just deeply, deeply attend to it. We're very, very clear with leaders what it takes to lead others, what it takes to lead personally, lead oneself, and what it takes to lead in a system. And we reinforce that, both in terms of training, in the show how. We give them the know-how with the tools and the process, and we reinforce it. It's tied to all of their experience here, how you get paid. Frankly, who gets hired, who gets fired, and who gets promoted. Those reinforcing mechanisms continually get back to what are we saying that is important from a permissible behavior point of view that leaders do. What is the role of leaders? Is there anything new and sexy in that? No, it's the rigor and the discipline of deeply institutionalizing and reinforcing through all the things I mentioned, the things that we all know, but common sense is not always common practice.
So then are you, if you're sitting there and kind of setting expectations for leaders throughout the organization, are you going through like every single one of these points on the strategic architecture and making sure that they really, and so making sure they really understand, So, but how?
We facilitate it and we hold them accountable to it, and our business planning process is a reinforcing mechanism, as in this is how you get funded, this is how you get goals aligned, this is what shows up at an operating committee, this is what lands up being on the prioritization list, this is where you'll get coached and supported and reinforced either through your HR or your finance colleague or myself in terms of the operating committee. So there's a lot of ways, both in terms of behaviors and processes, to reinforce this.
And how does this play out? I mean, obviously you're the head of HR and, kind of talent for the whole organization. How does this play out when it kind of cascades away from you to other people who are working in business partner roles and with other leaders throughout the organization?
We train them as well, Alec. For instance, just last week we had all of our vice presidents and above in a room where this is not a new process for us, but we are iterating on it and we're learning, and we get feedback loops similarly from our business planners that support lines of business. And we learn in a continuous way about what's working, what's not still making sense, where do people need more support and reinforcement or clarity, and we train those folks constantly, just like we do our executives that are fundamental goal owners and have to deliver the performance of the organization. I'm also delivering alongside of this some constant reinforcement about the behaviors. Last week, as an example, in the course of rolling this out as part of our business planning process and cycle again for this year, I'm talking to them about brain science. If you don't go into your planning process with all of this rigor and discipline, more times thinking about your thinking, not just doing, but also with the right posture, meaning the mindset that you actually believe, and it's in your muscle memory, that you think you can achieve collectively what you need the system to achieve. You don't have a whole lot of hope of getting thousands and thousands and thousands of people aligned and moved in the same direction. So we spend a lot of time making sure that both sides of that coin that get at behavior as much as process are constantly institutionalized and reinforced.
That's great. What kinds of kind of bumps in the road or resistance have you encountered as you tried to roll this out?
I think that everybody is suffering from the plague of this century, which is busyness. Everybody on this call, no doubt, when you meet people in the elevator and you ask them how they're doing, the answer is standard, busy. So there is a resistance, I think, from a vantage point of process for the sake of process. And you have to combat that because this is fundamentally about improving critical thinking, increasing alignment, and ensuring organizational performance. And so you do have to constantly combat that. I think the other side of it is it cannot just be process for the sake of process. You have to demonstrate that there are actual outcomes as a result of institutionalizing things like this. And as I said, we experience an awful lot of the lumpiness. It's not unique everywhere, but there are a couple of consistent themes. Moving a senior executive who had success for many years in different roles or different organizations through a conversation about philosophy versus starting at the level of strategy is a little bit of a mind warp for some people. Tell me what your deeply held beliefs are so that we don't move down a path assuming we're strategically aligned and we're using organizational resources, spending capital in ways that ultimately we find out down the road we're not aligned. That in and of itself is oftentimes a thing that leaders can resist because they have not been forced to spend the time to think about that, or they haven't developed a philosophical point of view yet, and you got to help them to do that, to articulate that. I think the other part is in the lumpiness of getting in the conversations that involve interpersonal interactions. Like I described, how many times I sat around an operating committee table where we all agreed that we wanted to do something on product innovation, for instance, and 6 months into the year, the chief marketing officer is talking about how they're struggling to be able to execute on something that's knit right into the operating plan that has some kind of financial implication. And it turns out, in large measure, the uneven is because they haven't gotten to shared goals with the IT organization. And they don't have a shared point of view about that's your responsibility as much as it's my accountability. That's why I talked about RACIs. Decision-making rights are also important. Do you have the right to de-scope my project and take money away from that and redirect it elsewhere? And that has to do with governance. Those things, as much as they are a time suck and they can absolutely be heavy and heavy work, they're necessary. And that's where I would say we've spent a lot of time trying to teach leaders about the importance of this, and unless and until they can see that there's a performance implication of it and why behavior is the other side of this coin. What is permissible behavior, and how do you set expectations around what leaders do? You don't just flit in here and tell us what you think strategy is and run off and let 1,000 flowers bloom. Otherwise, we ought to put your name on the building. And it's our members' money. That's how we think about it. So this is truly back to our purpose around what we're trying to achieve from a mission point of view, and we anchor our messaging and all of that as much as we do our training and our reinforcing mechanisms like process that I've just described.
That's great. Thank you. So let me just encourage people, if anybody has any questions for Mary or me, you should feel free to put them into the chat, and we will take them up there. While we're waiting, Mary, any further thoughts, or do you want to go on to the next slide?
Sure, you can move it along, Alec. I'm not sure that I have anything more to add, but please move to the next slide if you like. It's just a recap. As I said earlier, there are tools behind every one of these steps that do require training and reinforcing and facilitation.
So let me ask you a question. There in work that I've been looking at, so Jennifer Mueller, who is one of our colleagues here, who works with us here at CEO, she's done some very interesting work around kind of biases against creativity and innovation, and pointing out that a lot of times the strategy will say we need to be creating kind of blue sky, out of the box, brand new ways of doing things in the business. And yet, what people struggle with is when you have something that's very new and different, people often shut down in terms of their ability to be able to process it. I mean, they literally will have kind of negative reaction, and you can tell them, you need to embrace this, you need to embrace things that are different, but they will often literally, if they're not familiar with it, their head might be saying, oh, yeah, I should go ahead and embrace this because this is what the business needs, what the strategy, we need to be able to win against our competitors. But kind of in their gut, they retreat back because they don't even know how to process the information. It's new. You can't do typical kind of cost-benefit analysis because it's something so new and radically different. In talking with her, Alexis Fink, who's another one of our colleagues, I've worked with her for many years. Alexis and I were looking at Jen's findings and realizing that we think that there's some real implications for even how you think about cross-functional decision-making within organizations. So we talk about people being very busy, kind of going a mile a minute, but then having to deal with the complexity around the strategic architecture. It's very easy for them to fall back into a quick decision-making mode, right? And I can prioritize really well within my silo, but I oftentimes don't take enough time to be able to process information that comes from outside my silo because I don't necessarily know how to deal with it, and when the whole business is changing, that added complexity of having to work effectively across cross-functional lines can make the ability to be able to have a coherent, aligned strategic architecture even more difficult. Does this kind of resonate at all with what you're seeing in your experience?
So a lot in that, Alec. I'll try to answer your question. I think that the way we think about innovation is in a number of ways. There's big I and there's little I. So I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the work at Tufts Beyond the Idea. They think about innovation and the success of it, frankly, in large measure, based on various models of innovation. So if you're just trying to get slack out of the system, that requires a discipline of thinking and rigor at all times. And the kinds of things like you're talking about, intake of data, to help you rethink how you're going to improve process on a continual basis. That's different than moonshot type of innovation. And you sort of like the old Clayton Christensen work, you're going to think about different practices to achieve that, and you're potentially going to, like from our vantage point, it still requires a strategic architecture. Like you need to know what those risks are and how you're going to mitigate and how that ties to your risk appetite. You may do things a little bit differently in terms of how you fund that or how you cordon it off or institutionalize in the entire system, but it still requires that level of rigorous thinking. Innovation in of itself, this is often a pushback, right? That, if we want to innovate, why would we need to, have rigor? Well, it actually does require some gating. It does require some system sorting, so to speak, in terms of how you think about things. Is it just getting slack out of the system, or is it really a moonshot? And what's the stuff in between? And how do you validate whether or not you're going to put X% of your eggs in which basket? That requires some discipline of execution and thinking and rigor that is not unlike your operating cadence in your performance engine, so to speak. So we do think part of what a leader does is understand their system and understand their risk appetite and tie this into the rigor of decision-making and decision rights and choices, just like Big I, for instance, but it doesn't mean the same funding mechanisms or the exact same processes for evaluating performance. Like sometimes your evaluation, frankly, is just that you learned and you know that there's going to be some failure. I'm not sure if that answers your question entirely, Alec, but I would also say the flip side of the reason that book is called Beyond the Idea is because it assumes there are enough ideas. That's different, and I think that what I'm talking about is the discipline of execution of innovation. There's another tremendous thought leader that we do a lot of work with, and I'm a big fan of, is Dr. Srini Pillai out of Harvard, and his work, he's a neuroscientist and a psychiatrist. His work is really fundamentally around how you generate the ideas. And frankly, organizations that suffer from busyness, right? Like I said, the people that you meet in the elevator are probably going to say to you when you ask them how they're doing, they're busy. You generally aren't confronting the issues of fatigue, fear, that absolutely block innovation. And so you have to work both sides of that coin as well. How you're generating the ideas and creating a system that actually yields them, and removing the obstructions to it, and then also how you're executing against it. I don't know, Alec, if I got at your questions, but
yeah, no, well, and my question, we actually ran an entire program on innovation a couple months ago up in Silicon Valley, and so yeah, we can only do so much in a 5-minute exchange, but yeah, you definitely did a great job given the limited time. I do want to turn to some of the questions that people have now posted in the chat. I'm going to kind of structure these in order, if I can, based on kind of how the presentation went. So here's one. Given the need for leaders at every level, is there one leadership development model, or does the leadership development model differ at various organizational levels?
It's the same up and down the system, and it's really just segmented in 3 areas that I mentioned. But we do emphasize, and it gets more poignant, for instance, as you move along the trajectory of responsibility. So we focus on personal leadership, and that's really important. What do you own in your piece of the rock, and how do you get people in terms of interactions and dynamics operating in a way that's very healthy and constructive, and that they're owning that and continuously learning and doing that in an emotionally intelligent way as well as a strategically intelligent way. The second aspect is around people leadership and talent and connecting that human capital strategy to your business strategy. As I said, as you move along the curve and you have greater levels of responsibility, we might be emphasizing in a much more poignant and deeply sophisticated manner at a business unit president level, the kind of expectations we'd have for somebody there versus a supervisor or a people leader of, many in a contact center, for instance. And the third is systems leadership, and that has many components to it. You could think about it as integrative thinking, including business process, business architecture, critical thinking, creative thinking, and all of that comes together to be integrative thinking. So again, I would just simply say same competency model, for lack of a better way to describe it. We think about them as capabilities more than a competency model, but more acute as you move along a curve of responsibility in the span of accountability and control, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's the same framework. You want everybody thinking with all these different components.
That's right.
But how it gets operationalized can be very different for someone who's a second line, second level, up from first line supervisor, just one level up from there, versus somebody who's the head of a business unit.
That's right. Yeah, exactly right. I saw a question here, why in HR, and to what extent is that an advantage or a disadvantage? Would you like me to take that one on?
By all means, go for it.
So I'm both the chair of the operating committee of the firm. In that responsibility, I'm accountable for the enterprise operating plan and bringing decision-making frameworks to discern through all kinds of choices, both on an annualized basis as well as the long-term strategic goals that we have for the firm. I am the head of HR, and in that regard, in large measure, I'm accountable for institutionalizing with my colleagues and our CEO the behavior that is permissible that will arguably either be in the way of achieving strategy or an enabler of strategy. And I'm the head of communication. So it turns out all 3 of those things are reinforcing mechanisms from our perspective to ensure organizational performance. That's why it sits with me. That doesn't mean that it couldn't sit elsewhere. It's a combination of things, and in some sense it has to do with my ability to facilitate that in the breadth of accountabilities that I have. If you're in an organization where human resources and the leadership of it is narrow and isn't seen as a strategic thought partner, and particularly at the C-suite level, and isn't accountable for business outcomes, isn't a goal owner, then I could see lots of disadvantages where it could be seen as just another set of processes from the HR gal or guy. But I do think by virtue of the prominence that we place on integrating business planning and business capital with human capital and financial capital, there's a sort of coming together of those things under my leadership for those reasons.
Great. Let's go down to... so you mentioned the need to show tangible business outcomes or benefits from doing this. How do you actually show the link to the tangible business outcomes?
Well, in a number of ways. You want to say that you're actually achieving your operating plan, and we are. In fact, for the last 3 years in a row, we've overachieved our operating performance. You'd want to say on any one of these segments, right, that people in your system say they have confidence in company direction and they have trust in senior leaders, because if you weren't aligned philosophically, you wouldn't be saying those things. And if you didn't feel like strategically you were aligned, you wouldn't be saying those things. And we are. That's in the 90th percentile. You would want to say that from a human capital point of view, you have the readiness, the supply, and the mix, and frankly, the engagement of the human capital, whether that's the capacity or the capability to execute your plans when you want to do them. There's no shortage of great ideas in organizations, but there sure as heck is a shortage of human capital when you want to execute those plans if you haven't planfully and thoughtfully cultivated in that direction. And again, from an operating model point of view, it doesn't mean you have to own it. You might be running it, but you have to be ready. You have to have that supply, and you have to have that mix so that it represents the community that you serve, and you're credible to the brand that you hope to withhold and the values that you stand for. So I would say you have to be living up to all your financial metrics. You have to be living up to the performance that you set for yourself. Your stakeholders have to say you're improving continuously, and the people that you're hopeful to keep to help you continually win have to say, I feel like I'm part of something that's really purposeful and matters, and we are. On lots of different measures, we could point to ways that people would reinforce that.
Yeah, and what I would add to that, this is getting to that same question from Jeffrey. What I've seen in the work that I've done with companies over the years is that this is where the need for integration and for that system thinking, as you said, Mary, is really important, because there are so many different metrics that we have, so many goals we have to achieve operationally, financially, with our people. And people can get very distracted by, there's a lot of execution that has to happen to just keep the lights on. There's a lot of things we have to do to keep cash flow coming in, in your case, to process claims, to make sure that, people are satisfied as customers. And you have to hit all those metrics. But there's going to be a kind of a smaller set of strategic objectives that really are the indicators of how well your business is evolving in the right direction it needs to go in to be able to execute the strategy and stay ahead of your competitors. And it's that ability, and so you need to be able to do the table stakes, the stuff that you have to do on a daily basis, but then step back frequently and look across the business and say, for those strategic measures, how are we doing on those, and to make sure you're hitting them at the same time. And using the capabilities language, there's the capabilities we need to be able to kind of execute the current business to make sure we're meeting all our current objectives. But then there's the capabilities you need to be building and executing on so that you can be evolving as the market evolves. And it's that ambidexterity of being able to do both of those that, and to your point, Mary, you need to be looking at the measures. There's going to be financial and business measures that tell you, are you actually accomplishing your performance in the market? There's going to be operational ones that are kind of measures of, are you getting there the right way? And then there's people-related ones that say, are you actually getting people's discretionary effort? Are you getting their time and attention? Are you getting their commitment? And you can't focus on only one set of those. You have to look at them all together and make sure you're balancing them appropriately.
I think that's right. I think the only other thing I'd add, Alec, is the idea of waste. And boy, if you want to know whether or not you are wasting organizational capital, financial capital, human capital, just go out and ask the system. That's a really important ongoing pulse check and a measure of whether or not beyond are we hitting these things, because you could be performing, but you also might have a lot of waste in that. And so there are ways that you have to pulse check on all of those dimensions as well.
Yep, absolutely. Maybe we can just do one more, because there's someone had a question about the program in November, which I want to answer, but let's do, okay, so when it comes, this will be the last question we take here. So when it comes to operationalizing the strategic architecture approach by your business units and divisions, how does that happen? I mean, are you having each business unit, division, or function head kind of do their own version of this whole process?
Yeah, I'd say every single business unit, maybe for generic terms, business unit president or head, and including every functional head is going to come to an operating committee and present their culmination of this, and they're going to work horizontally before they do that. We're going to help to facilitate that, and then it culminates with some guidance, top-down, obviously, but they will come and present all of that culminates in a financial ask and an input to an overall business plan. That's how the plan comes together, and it's the core accountability of the operating team, of the operating committee, is to deliver a plan. And through that, we've already discerned, we've navigated with each other what the trade-offs are, we understand what the constraints are, we build shared goals, we know what the financial model needs to look like, and we're connecting this always to the prime strategy of the organization. How does it fit in next in, for instance, on wanting to be a great place to work? How does it help create a trusted advisor experience for our members? So there are guardrails, so to speak, that are those prime strategies that tie to our mission that help to inform, and it all culminates in everybody using the same process, going through the same level of inquiry and rigor with their colleagues and challenge around all of this, and it fundamentally informs the enterprise plan.
That's great. Thank you. Let me just show this again. So we had one specific question here around what the overall content of the workshop in November was going to be. So the specific answer for Michelle is that we're going to do everything in person, so this isn't we're not having a kind of a before-after component. There's, in terms of the content we're going to cover, what you've heard here from Mary is a great kind of strategic, kind of high-level view of one approach that, that she takes at Blue Shield. And we're going to hear a number of different approaches, and they're not going to all be this high level. Some are going to get down into the level of kind of talking specifically about what kinds of capabilities are we building and how do we build that at the different levels. They're specific business cases of what does it mean to be looking at kind of a go-to-market capability in an organization like Frito-Lay and PepsiCo, where we have to be building the right capabilities at the job level, the team level, and then end-to-end across that business process. And also enabling people who are attending to kind of bring their questions forward so that we can address them as well. So it's going to be a highly interactive and engaging approach. It's 3 days on the calendar, but it's actually only 2 days of content. So it starts with afternoon on the 5th, full day on the 6th, and then morning on the 7th. So people can easily fly in and out on the first and the last day. And with that, I want to thank you. Thank you, Mary, very much for your participation. It was really great. And
my pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, and to encourage everybody, first of all, to attend the program in November, but also to just engage with us here at the center. We really appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you at a future event.